August 11th, 1945. North Field, Tinian Island, Mariana Islands. The night air clung to Lieutenant Mark Ellison like a wet blanket as he followed the sergeant down the narrow coral road. The jeep's headlights picked out twin rows of palm stumps and coiled barbed wire, then swung toward a low, hump-backed mound rising from the darkness. One solitary bulb shone above a steel door set into the earth. The rest of the island was muffled in blackout gloom. But here, under that yellow cone of light, everything felt exposed. "Here she is, sir," the sergeant muttered, hopping out and adjusting the Thompson on his shoulder. A signboard, stenciled in black, stared back at them, authorized, "Personnel only igloo. Special weapons storage." Ellison wiped a line of sweat from his temple. It was past midnight, yet the tropical heat still folded around him, thick with the smell of dust, diesel, and the faint, sour reek of the sea. Somewhere behind them, a B-29 engine coughed and wound down, its blades ticking to a stop. "Open it up," Ellison said. His voice sounded too loud in the quiet. The sergeant produced a key ring, then another, then the small flat one that mattered. First came the heavy padlock, then a second lock mounted over the latch. Finally, he slid back a steel bar that rasped like a file along metal. Each layer of security felt less like protection and more like a series of questions. "Are you sure you want to see what is on the other side?" The door swung inward with a reluctant groan. Cool, dry air spilled out, smelling faintly of oil, paint, and the aseptic tang of newly poured concrete. Two bare bulbs flickered on, revealing a space that looked more like a bank vault than a weapons cache. The walls were thick, the ceiling low, the floor smooth. Crates were stacked along the sides in neat, numbered rows, their stencils crisp despite the island's humidity. At the far end of the bunker, on a waist-high steel table, sat what Ellison had come to see. A gray steel shipping container, about the size of a small travel trunk, waited in the middle of the table under a canvas cover. Beside it, in their own padded cases, rested smaller cylinders and sealed boxes, each tagged with red-bordered labels and codes that meant nothing to anyone outside a very small circle of men scattered between Tinian, Los Alamos, and Washington. Ellison stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop a few precious degrees. The sergeant stayed by the door, eyes moving between the corridor outside and the table inside, as if trouble could come from either direction. "Lights are good." "Sir, humidity is holding where they want it," the sergeant said, nodding at a gauge bolted to the wall. "No leaks, no pests. We check every 4 hours." Ellison barely heard him. His gaze was fixed on the canvas. He had seen drawings back in New Mexico. He had watched men in white coats and rubber gloves lean over gleaming hemispheres of metal, talking in a language of cross-sections and critical masses that set his teeth on edge. He had watched a desert night turn to day and felt a heat that seemed to reach inside his bones. But this was different. This was not a test shot on a remote stretch of sand. This was a corps prepared for war, or one heartbeat away from it. Somewhere in the Pacific, a ship held the rest of the components. Somewhere on the other side of the island, ground crews kept one B-29 on a tighter leash than all the others. All of that floated at the edge of Ellison's thoughts as he reached out and folded the canvas back. The container underneath was unremarkable at first glance. Scuffed from travel, corners protected with dull metal reinforcements, a simple serial number painted in black along the lid. Only the extra locks, the lead seals, and the clipped, wary tone of the men who handled it hinted at what sat inside. "Nearly ready," they said. Ellison murmured, almost to himself. "Another few days?" The sergeant shifted his weight. "You think we'll need it, sir." Ellison let the canvas fall back into place, the fabric whispering against metal. Outside, Thunder rolled faintly over the sea, or perhaps it was just another B-29 climbing into the night. "I hope to God we don't," he said. "But they built this place so we could." He took one last look around the bunker, the concrete walls, the neatly stacked crates, the humming ventilation fans fighting the island air, a small, self-contained world designed to cradle something that could erase entire cities. He turned for the door, not knowing that in a few weeks this igloo would be quiet, its purpose suddenly uncertain, and that years later another set of men would walk into this same cool air, clipboards in hand, to inventory what had been left behind and what had almost been used. The next morning the sun came up hard and white over Tinian, bleaching the air and turning every sheet of metal into a mirror. From the bluffs above North Field, the rows of B-29s looked like silver fish laid out on a slab, each one flanked by fuel trucks and sweating crew chiefs. Lieutenant Ellison stood at the edge of the hard stand, coffee canteen in his hand, watching as ground crews swarmed over one particular aircraft parked apart from the others. Its bomb bay doors were open, and beneath the belly, a small group of officers in khaki and mechanics in oil-streaked coveralls clustered around a dolly and a set of hoists that gleamed like surgery tools. "You can always tell which bird is special." A voice beside him said. It was Captain Joe Harkins from Operations. Cap tilted back, shirt dark at the armpits. He nodded toward the guarded aircraft. Marines stood around it in a loose ring, rifles slung, helmets catching the light. An MP Jeep idled nearby, antenna bouncing. "That one does not get scratched," Harkins added. They already called from the top asking about humidity in the igloos. Ellison grunted. He could still feel the cool air of Igloo 8 on his skin, even in this heat. The image of the gray container on the steel table lingered unpleasantly at the back of his mind, like a memory of something he should not have seen. "You hear anything more from Washington?" he asked. Hawkins shrugged. "Rumors. Some say the next target is already picked. Some say they are waiting to see what Tokyo does after Nagasaki. All I know is they are keeping the third package on ice out here, and nobody wants to be the one who says we do not need it after all." He said it lightly, but there was no humor in his eyes. Later that afternoon, Ellison rode back out toward the storage area. The road wound past revetments and fuel dumps, then into a less traveled stretch of scrub and coral. Here the igloos rose from the earth in a pattern only a draftsman or a bombardier would find, beautiful arcs of concrete mounds spaced carefully apart, each with a single steel door and a strip of cleared ground around it. The heat hit him like a wall as he stepped out. Cicadas rattled in the brush. A Marine at the checkpoint checked his pass with more attention than usual, eyes flicking from the paper to Ellison's face and back again. Inside the fence line, the igloos sat mute and identical, their grassy coverings making them look almost natural, like odd little hills that had always been there. Inside Igloo, the air was still cool, the bulbs still burning. The sergeant on duty snapped to attention as Ellison entered. "Any changes?" "No, sir. Gauges are steady. No sign of moisture. We logged a minor fluctuation about an hour ago, but it corrected. Probably just one of the fans cycling." Ellison walked to the table. The canvas remained in place. Corners weighted with neat steel clamps. Beside it, 3 smaller containers sat in a row, each tagged with codes from Los Alamos and the initials of ordnance officers who had checked and rechecked their contents. Detonators, firing circuits, components that, paired with the core and a suitable airframe, would turn blueprint and math into something else entirely. He imagined, not for the first time, the path this core had taken, shaped in a laboratory far inland, carried by train under ordinary freight cars, moved from dock to ship with guards who pretended they were just babysitting machine parts. Then across thousands of miles of ocean, through submarine lanes and tropical storms, to end up here in a bunker smaller than some farm sheds back home. "You know," the sergeant said quietly, Some of the boys think this thing is cursed. First one over Hiroshima, the second over Nagasaki. Figure if there is a third, it cannot mean anything good. Ellison did not answer. Out on the runway, another B-29 roared into the sky. The sound vibrated through the concrete, a low, insistent growl that went on and on. That night, word spread through the mess halls and tents that Tokyo was sending signals, that the Emperor himself might speak. Men gathered around radios, straining to catch voices through the static, while somewhere out beyond the runway, a small hill of concrete and steel sat in the dark, its cargo waiting patiently for a set of orders that might never come. History would later mark this period with dates and cables and memoranda. But inside the igloos, nothing changed. The ventilation fans hummed, the gauges ticked, the canvas stayed draped. Only much later would anyone unseal those doors, not as handlers, but as investigators, their clipboards ready to record what war had prepared and then set aside. The waiting stretched across the next days like a drawn breath. On the morning of August 14th, the air above Tinian trembled with heat and rumor. In briefing tents and under the shade of engine nacelles, men argued over half-heard bulletins from the shortwave sets, over fragments of intercepted messages, over the tone in the voices that came from higher up. In the operations shack, Ellison stood by the open window, shirt stuck to his back, listening as a radio man cupped a hand over his headphones. The man scribbled, paused, then looked up at the duty officer. "Sir, they are saying something about an acceptance of terms. Still confused, a lot of traffic, but it sounds like they might actually be folding." The room went very still. Someone let out a low whistle. Another man laughed once. Too loud. Harkins caught Ellison's eye. "Do not uncork anything yet. They have told us the war was almost over before. Those birds are still on strip alert, and that igloo of yours is still getting more attention than the officers' club." Ellison nodded. He knew it was true. Even as the radios crackled with news from Tokyo, the military clock on the wall kept marching in its own rhythm. Bomb-loading crews stayed on call. Weather officers plotted wind patterns over distant cities that might never see the silver glint of a B-29 overhead. And out beyond the fuel dumps and ammunition stacks, Igloo 8 sat beneath its blanket of soil, its cooling fans humming at a level tone. That afternoon, Ellison took a jeep back to the storage area. The sky had gone hazy, clouds piling to the west, but the heat had not broken. Marine guards at the perimeter checkpoint were stripped down to undershirts, helmets tilted low over their eyes, rifles still ready. "You again?" "Sir," one of them said as he checked Ellison's papers. "Guess whatever is in there is not going anywhere without you knowing it." "That is the idea," Ellison said. Inside the fence, the igloos rose in two neat rows, their curved backs covered in grass and dust. Numbers were stenciled by each steel door. Some housed conventional bombs, stacked in careful nests. Others held fuses and incendiaries. Only a few, including number 8, were on the special list, with extra guards assigned and logs filled in a hand that did not shake. The door to Igloo 8 opened with a familiar rasp of steel on steel. Cool air brushed his face. The same bulbs glowed. The same gauges ticked. The sergeant on duty handed over the log, his pencil tucked behind one ear. "Temperature steady, sir. Humidity holding. No sign of intrusion. We had a call from base headquarters about 20 minutes ago asking for confirmation that the primary container is secure." Ellison looked at the table. The gray shipping case sat as it had before, canvas draped over it like a shroud. The 3 smaller containers beside it had not moved. Tags fluttered slightly in the faint breath of the ventilation system. He rested his fingertips lightly on the canvas, feeling its rough weave. Somewhere in the world, men in uniforms far grander than his argued over surrender terms and imperial dignity and the wording of documents. Here, in this bunker carved from coral and poured concrete, The outcome of those arguments would decide whether this core remained an object or became an event. If they sign, the sergeant said quietly. What happens to it? Ellison kept his eyes on the canvas. Then it stays right here until someone with more brass than me decides otherwise. They will want to look it over, write reports, pat themselves on the back for not needing it. Might even bring in inspectors, scientists, you name it. Nobody builds something like this and just forgets it exists. The sergeant nodded, though his brow stayed creased. Outside, a distant cheer rose from the direction of the tents, then another, rolling across the field like a gust of wind. Radios carried words in languages most of the men did not understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Ellison closed the logbook, signed his name, and handed it back. For the first time since he had stepped into Igloo 8, he let himself imagine that the locks on the door might never be opened in anger, that the codes and seals might be broken not by loaders working against a countdown, but by inspectors and archivists in a quieter time. He stepped back out into the bright, noisy, overheated world of a base that had just been told the fighting would stop. Behind him, the steel door shut, and the igloo sank once more into silence. Inside, the Third Corps waited, nearly ready, surrounded by its detonators and firing gear, suspended in the narrow gap between the war that had been and the reckoning that would follow. By early 1946, Northfield no longer roared. The great waves of B-29s had gone, flown back to the States or to scrap yards. The hard stands that once baked under the weight of engines and bomb loads sat nearly empty, stained with old oil, their white lines fading in the sun. Palm fronds had crept back toward the edges of the runways. In some of the old tent areas, grass was pushing up through the packed coral. A C-54 brought the inspectors in. It touched down in a haze of dust and heat, engines coughing as they wound down. Out of its belly stepped a small group, 2 Army officers in freshly pressed khaki, a pair of civilians in rumpled suits, and a technical sergeant hauling a crate of instruments. All of them squinted in the glare, hands going to caps or glasses. "Welcome to Tinian, gentlemen," said the local base commander, a colonel whose tan line suggested he did not often see air conditioning. "You are here about the special storage facilities." "That is right, Colonel," replied Major William Carter of the Manhattan District, adjusting his glasses. Beside him, Dr. Samuel Klein, a physicist on temporary duty from what he always referred to simply as the project, shaded his eyes and looked past the colonel toward the inland rise where the igloos lay. They drove out in 2 jeeps, rattling over cracked coral roads lined with rusting fuel drums and abandoned revetments. The chatter in the vehicles was clipped, professional. They spoke of humidity profiles, concrete curing times, the compatibility of island conditions with long-term storage of plutonium components. As the jeeps crested a low hill, the igloos came into view, rows of grass-covered mounds, their doors facing a cleared strip of crushed coral, guard towers standing silent at the perimeter. The Marines were still there, fewer now, uniforms a little more relaxed, but rifles present all the same. This area was built to hold multiple special assemblies, the colonel explained as they dismounted. Cores, detonators, firing sets. Igloos 8 and 9 have the primary arrangements. The others were designated for additional units. Had they been shipped? Carter nodded, making notes on a clipboard. "We have your earlier reports, Colonel, but Washington wants a full post-war inspection, physical verification, storage capacity, condition of any remaining components, logs of handling and access." The door to Igloo 8 resisted at first, its seals reluctant after months of being opened less often. The sergeant assigned to the detail worked the locks, then put his shoulder to the steel. With a scrape and a hollow boom, the door swung inward. Cool air flowed out, still carrying that familiar mix of oil, paint, and concrete dust. The bulbs flickered to life, illuminating the cramped interior. Klein stepped in first, eyes adjusting. Humidity control is still functioning. That is good, he murmured. He moved along the wall, checking gauges while Carter and the others headed straight for the far table. There it was. The gray steel shipping container sat under its canvas shroud, just where Ellison had left it months before. The corners were still secured with clamps, the lead seals still intact, the painted serial number only slightly dulled by the island air. Beside it, the 3 smaller containers waited in their neat row, tags yellowed but legible. Carter ran a finger along the edge of the canvas. "Logbook," he said. The sergeant produced it. The pages were filled with tight handwriting, columns of times and temperatures, initials from long-gone shifts. Klein flipped through, his brow furrowing. "Here," he said, tapping a page. August 14th, access check by Lieutenant Ellison, followed by continuous monitoring. No record of removal or assembly. The Corps never left this igloo, which means it should still be in the transport cradle. Carter replied. He looked up. "Sergeant, note that the seals appear unbroken. Proceed with documented unsealing." The process took time. Photographs were taken of each lock, each seal. Notes were dictated, repeated back, written down in triplicate. Only then did Carter nod, and the clamps came off one by one with small metallic clicks. Klein lifted the canvas. The men leaned in. Inside the container, nested in shock mounts and lined with carefully cut padding, sat the heart of the 3rd weapon, not yet fully mated to its initiators, still lacking some final adjustments, but unmistakably what it was, a plutonium core, its work at the foundry and machine shop complete, its future interrupted by a surrender broadcast. "Nearly ready for deployment," Klein said softly. "Final assembly could have been completed here with the equipment on hand. The detonator units are present, and the firing circuitry is in those side cases." He looked around the igloo, at the thick walls, the ventilation, the evidence of careful planning for more than one such assembly. They built this island to handle several of these at once. He went on. "Cores moving in, detonators arriving by separate transport, all staged for operations that never happened." Carter wrote, his pencil scratching on the clipboard. "Recommend notation 3rd Corps confirmed in storage at time of inspection. Facility capable of housing multiple additional units had they been produced." Behind them, the sergeant shifted his weight, eyes flicking between the men and the dull metal object in the box. For him, it was not equations or capacity reports. It was the ghost of a city that had never burned. Klein stayed bent over the container for a long moment, his reflection faint in the dull metal. The air in the igloo felt cooler than before, edged with something like unease. "Sergeant, Geiger counter," he said. The technical sergeant with the crate of instruments stepped forward, snapping open latches. He passed over a handheld unit with a cracked black casing. Klein checked the battery, flicked a switch, and the quiet space filled with the dry chatter of the tube. He held the probe over the open container, moving slowly, listening to the tempo of the clicks. Carter watched the needle on the dial creep upward, then settle. "Activity is within expected bounds," Klein said. "No sign of compromise. Shielding is still effective enough for storage." "Log it," Carter replied. The sergeant scribbled. Date, time, instrument number, readings, signatures. Each line another stitch binding the story of this object to paper. Klein eased the canvas all the way back, exposing the mounts and the way the core sat held by straps and brackets. He pointed with the probe. "Note the fixtures. This cradle is built for rapid transfer to an assembly stand. They could have completed the final steps here on Tinian. Insert the initiator, make the last adjustments to the tamper configuration, tie it into the firing set. Hours, not days." Carter imagined the scene as Klein spoke. An assembly hut somewhere on the island, perhaps already built or at least marked on a map. Workbenches, chain hoists anchored into beams, technicians in fatigues and gloves, officers with clipboards, a B-29 waiting on a nearby strip. He wrote as he pictured it, capturing the details in clipped phrases that would later appear as dry lines in a report. Document that the site infrastructure was adequate for at least one more operational deployment, he said. Storage, security, environmental control, core and detonators physically present, ready for integration. They moved to the smaller cases. One by one, seals were inspected, photographed, then broken. Under the lids lay arrays of sockets and cabling, compact metal assemblies wrapped in waxed paper. The parts looked almost mundane, like something from a factory floor, until Klein described in quiet, precise language the role each would have played in shaping the wave of compression around the core. Outside, the sunlight shifted. A breeze pushed dust along the coral strip. In the guard tower, a Marine leaned on the rail and watched a lizard dart between tufts of grass on the igloo roof. Inside, the men wove behavior and possibility together. According to the manifests, additional cores could have been shipped once production ramped, Carter said, flipping through another sheaf of papers from a battered folder. The bunker system has unused capacity. How many could safely be stored at once, in your estimation? Klein ran a hand along the cool concrete wall. With the current spacing and ventilation, several. The limiting factor would be operational security and transport, not this facility. They built for expansion. He glanced back at the open container. This is what expansion would have looked like. Carter nodded. The pencil wrote on. There were sections to fill in later assessment of long-term storage suitability, recommendations for disposition, comments on environmental control. He could already hear the questions that would come from offices far away. Could these igloos be reused? Should they be dismantled? Could similar designs be adapted for new stockpiles on other islands or in continental depots? For the sergeant and the guards, none of that mattered. To them, the most important line in the notebook was simple core, present, intact, not used, at last. Klein gave a small sigh and stepped back. I have seen these things in calculations and in one bright flash in the desert. I have seen the photographs from Japan. This is the first time I have looked at one that did not get its city. No one answered. The hum of the ventilator filled the pause. All right, Carter said. We have visual confirmation, instrument readings, and condition notes. Seal it back up according to procedure. Then we will inspect the neighboring igloos and the external security measures. After that, we interview any remaining personnel who handled the core during transit and storage. Every signature we can find. The canvas went back over the container, smoothed flat like a blanket. The clamps clicked into place again. New seals crimped with careful pressure. The lid closed on the smaller cases. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the brightness felt harsher than before. The air heavier. Carter shielded his eyes and looked along the line of mounds, each one a potential that had never been fully realized. Behind him, an igloo. The third core sat once more in manufactured twilight, its history now locked not in a target list, but in notebooks and photographs. It had moved from the column marked operations to the column marked evidence. What the inspectors had found would travel home in crates and envelopes, in typed summaries and technical annexes. Long after the runway stains had faded and the palms had reclaimed the coral, their words would be what remained of this quiet island arsenal that had almost been used again. Years later, long after the inspectors had flown out and their reports had been filed away in cabinets far from the Pacific, the igloos at Tinian settled into a different kind of silence. The war debris vanished first. The wrecked trucks were hauled off or left to rust into nothing. The temporary huts came down, Runways that had once shuddered beneath the weight of bombers grew cracks, then weeds. Salt wind and rain began to work on the concrete, softening edges that had once been sharp with urgency. But Igloo 8 remained. On a humid afternoon in the early 1950s, a staff officer at an air base in the States slid a folder across a desk to a visiting researcher. The folder was thick, its edges worn. On the tab, in neat black letters, were a few words and a series of numbers that would mean little to anyone who was not already looking for them. Inside were copies of Carter's notes, Klein's technical comments, the photographs taken in the cool half-light of the bunker. Grainy black and white images showed the concrete interior, the steel table, the open container. In one frame, the plutonium core sat nestled in its cradle, straps looping over it like the arms of someone holding a dangerous child. "If you read between the lines," the staff officer said, "you will see that by August 1945 we had not just 2 weapons ready, but a system. Storage, transport, assembly, deployment. That island was built to keep the line running." The researcher flipped through the pages, lips moving silently as he traced the dates. July shipments, August checks, the inspection in 1946 confirming that the Third Corps had never left its concrete cave. On the last page, in a section marked simply "Recommendation," Carter had written that the Tinian facilities were suitable as a model, not as a monument, not as a warning, but as a template for future depots. Back on the island itself, the meaning settled in more slowly, in time. The Marines left. The gates sagged on their hinges. Local workers came and went, some using the old roads, a few cutting paths that ran close to the buried igloos. From the outside, they looked harmless enough, just low hills with aging metal doors. Children pointed at them from trucks, giving them nicknames. The stories traded in the shade said that some of the hills had held bombs bigger than anything dropped before or since. You can imagine walking there one day, years after the war. The air still hot, the cicadas still drilling their endless chorus into the trees. You follow a track past concrete that has lost its paint, past a rusted sign where only a few letters remain. An igloo rises ahead, half swallowed by grass. If you could step inside, you would feel the sudden cool, smell damp concrete and old dust. The shelves would be empty now, the table bare. There would be no container, no canvas, no humming fans, only the shape of the space. The memory of how it was used hangs in the air like the echo of a shout long gone. Somewhere far away, the core that once sat here would have met a different fate. Melted, reworked, reassigned to other plans in a world that had learned just enough from Hiroshima and Nagasaki to hesitate, but not enough to turn away entirely. The detonators and firing gear would have been studied, updated, replaced by more compact, more efficient designs. What the inspectors had found on Tinian became one thread in a much larger fabric. But for the men who had stood in that bunker in 1945 and 1946, it was simpler. It was the knowledge that a city had been spared not by mercy, but by timing, not by a change of heart, but by surrender coming just ahead of the next mission order. On maps, the igloos are small symbols. In files, they are facility numbers and storage capacity figures. In reality, they were rooms built to cradle devices that turned physics into fire on a scale no one had truly understood until it was too late. Igloo 8 never sent its core into the sky. Instead, it became a vault for a possibility that stayed locked away, then dissolved into history. The concrete still stands, aging under the same sun that once glared off silver wings, guarding a space where, for a brief and dangerous moment, a third bomb waited for a command that never came.